and welcome to The Brood. I'm Chris, and this episode we are talking about the slasher film. The slasher film is a subgenre of horror that gained prominence and was really probably the most visible and lucrative subgenre in horror during the 1980s with films like Friday the 13th, arguably Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play. Pretty much anything you can name probably could comfortably be put into the slasher film subgenre. A very, very divisive genre among critics and horror fans alike. And I guess to give a little context, I just wanted to give a brief definition and kind of history of what this film would be. Basically, we could probably do a quick history of this film and look at Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho as the starting point. Eventually, we get to Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is kind of another iteration of this. And then eventually we get John Carpenter's film Halloween. And I think we can safely say after Halloween, most slasher films are basically an iteration of the film Halloween to greater and lesser degrees. And as a qualifier to that, I want to. There are a lot of films that could be credited with being a part of the prototype of the slasher film, but this is just kind of a general working definition and history. So if anyone, I don't want to receive any letters or angry phone calls because I like to imagine there's a world where that happens. Anyway, but I am joined, like always, by two very awesome critical horror fans. I have here Letitia.
Hello.
And Josh.
Hello.
And they're very, very excited to be talking about slasher films this week. And the three films that we chose were Josh's choice was Slumber Party Massacre, I believe, by Amy Holden, 1982. Letitia chose The Burning, 1981, Tony Maylam. And I chose the most recent film, Malevolence, by Stephen Mina from 2003. And these films seem to kind of correspond pretty well to some of the bigger thematic things we want to talk about this episode. But I did want to bring up an essay that Letitia exposed the three of us to that's really relevant to the slasher genre. It's Carol Clover's essay, Her Body Himself, that addresses the idea of gender in the slasher film. And it's a pretty loaded essay with a lot of insight to a lot of aspects to this genre. And it'd be way too much to kind of try to break it down. So Letitia has a kind of a good summation from an outside source of what the thesis that this essay arrives at. So if you wanted to give that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So in the essay, it talks about the way that gender identification is happening, who we identify with and when. And it kind of reaches an interesting conclusion about the way that the final girl is working in the film. And that's a really common, I guess, trope in this genre that we will probably talk about. And so I'm not sure exactly who the author is of this article, but we'll put it up on the Brood post for this episode. But it has a really good summary of the conclusion that she comes to, and it's that the slasher film reaches out deeply and almost obsessively to the male complex. Yet, thematically, the categories of masculinity and femininity are collapsed into one anatomically female character. And it's talking about the final girl here. The male audiences invest a lot of emotion with a woman in fear and pain, and even in the case of horror spectatorship, the viewer answers to her emotions, which is a feminine experience. And I'll stop there. It kind of goes on from that.
Yeah, I think that's really something that was really helpful to spark this. It's helpful to spark this conversation off because there is a more nuanced and kind of complex understanding of what this genre does, and I think that's really interesting in like kind of stark relief to the fact that this is, I think, quite often considered the dumb genre of horror. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, like, and I'm a convert because I used to kind of feel the same way, and now I really, really love these films. But I think, talking about gender is, I a great place to start is your pick, Slumber Party Massacre. Josh, I wondered if you wanted to kind of talk about that film right now.
Sure, yeah. Slumber Party Massacre from 1982 has the kind of distinction of being helmed almost exclusively by women, written and directed by. And it's coming in 1982 at kind of the tail end of the classic slasher era. And it's an interesting film to my mind. I mean, one, it's just a whole lot of fun. It's just,
yeah,
which is something we need to talk about, I think, is why movies with teenagers being dismembered in series is just so much fun in general. But it kind of sets itself up as a parody, and hopefully we'll talk about the ways that it does and doesn't work as a parody. Plot-wise, we hardly need to summarize most of these plots. We've got a party happening with teenagers. There's an escaped murderer. Of course, these two things have to come together. And we get a guy running around with a 3-foot-long power drill, killing lots of nubile girls. And their kind of dumb male counterparts. So. But I guess you introduced it, Chris, as being kind of our introduction to talking about genre, and I don't know. I think what I find interesting about it is the way that it attempts to parody slasher movies by highlighting all of those kind of gender questions. There's the roving eye of the camera that just kind of. I've never felt a camera leer in the way that the camera does in these movies. When we get our shower scene and it just, and it is kind of winking at the audience, but, and the fact that our male killer is running around with this giant phallus that he's killing people with, is all kind of over the top. But what I find most interesting is how the more over the top it goes, the more it really adheres to what makes these movies work, and therefore it's not really a parody at all. It works. It is the thing that it's parodying, and a pretty darn fun and effective one, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really strong proof that a lot of the strength of these films is in this pretty strong formula that they have, and even in Her Body himself, there's Clover compares these films to folk tales, and I think that Slumber Party Massacre to me is the closest that we get to a folk tale, or something like Black Christmas even. But I mean that this sounds like a story that someone would tell someone else, or like a rumor or a myth around a neighborhood about the night these women had a slumber party and the escaped mental patient came and killed all of them. And it could be, I think, kind of reduced to, on a story level, something that's simple, and it's just really powerful because of that. And the more it feeds into it, I think the stronger this film gets. So I think it's a great argument for something that is consciously has parody elements, but also is the thing in itself so intensely. But the idea of gender in this film, I think, is also something that is interesting, and you brought up because this is a film made by and promoted as a film made by women, like as a point of interest, but written and directed by women. But it still does engage in everything that these movies are expected to do.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about this movie, though, in the Clover structure, or her idea that the movie is about sort of male complexes. I'm using little air quotes, about violence towards women or objectification of women. She seems to be saying that this is a way to play through that sort of interior drama of masculinity or whatever. But in this movie, the gaze is so ridiculously present that you can't, like there's no moment in which I lost my in the film in this sort of psychological identification way that she seems to be talking about. Like I always was like, oh, it's kind of making fun of the voyeuristic camera, and the female characters are so sort of intimidating and interesting and strong that at no point did I feel real threat, even though he does kill people, from this sort of ridiculous killer. Like he's kind of ridiculous. He's not
absolutely, yeah.
He's not really that shadowy or scary. He actually is too visible, even from the beginning. And so in a way, it kind of doesn't allow this kind of ceremony of gender play to happen. But I still love it. Like that's not really a critique of the film. I think it's doing something slightly different, yet the same, like you guys are saying.
I agree 100%, and yet it doesn't really change my opinion. I think that there's, as Chris said, these films are so simple, and I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think that, critical attention to these movies is something that you're discussing your kind of experiential, the movie on the experiential level, and how, you weren't feeling the things that Clover described. And I think that a critical engagement with these movies is on a whole other level than the way they're supposed to work. Like I don't, I think that in other movies that aren't trying to be parodies, the same kind of, a lot of those tropes that we expect, the shower scene and the fake out and all those things, that we're there and we experience them. And what Clover is doing and what we're attempting to do is just a whole other level that doesn't actually, I don't think it comes into the experience of the movie.
I think that's a good point, but I kind of disagree, because I feel like when I've seen a really, let's say Halloween or Friday the 13th, something really, really simple yet elegant and well done, I feel like those things happen where you start to identify with points of view, where I don't know, I just feel like I was a little bit at a step removed in a way that I haven't been with really effective slasher films. And I think I compare this to The Burning, where I felt there was something mysterious and strange and really interesting about being in the point of view of the murder in that one. And I felt like things were happening that I wasn't realizing, and if I stepped back, I would be able to do an analysis, but it was sort of a natural identification with certain characters. Whereas with this one, it's just so highlighted, I feel like I'm a little bit taken out of that. So that was the only element of parody that I felt, though, that being taken out of the way that a film can trick you into certain identifications. I don't know if I'm making sense anymore.
No, yeah, you are. I think let's talk about specific things about that, because in a lot of ways, I think that at least as a film that has a dimension of being critical about what it is, Slumber Party Massacre is, one of the best you're going to find. Very, very successful. I think we talked about it almost renders Scream obsolete. It's
Definitely.
it's a very sophisticated parody of that. And I think by foregrounding the gaze, which is the main mode that you experience these films through, by having these loser teenage boys like goofballs looking through the window, I mean, they're lame. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that this movie is really, really funny, in that way. And it's almost maybe we're bringing more to it possibly than theirs, but I think it is a really, really clever, it's a clever riff on those tropes and the way that these films operate. And I like what you were saying about the world this movie creates, where the women are really strong. You don't feel vulnerable. This is another dimension kind of than you've ever seen in a film, where all the strong roles are women. It's a world where men are just kind of there and hapless. And we're going into another area, which is something else I like about the film. But I think, that foregrounding you're talking about absolutely short circuits that kind of experiential dimension of these movies. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this film.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's something about, and I'm not sure how deep to get into this, but there's something about Clover's analysis that in itself kind of reinforces, a lot of gender roles, and very delineated gender roles. And we're still, no matter how complex her analysis gets, we're still very much in a simplistic kind of understanding of all of those things. And I like that about this movie, and that it, you said that if it's like this movie renders Scream obsolete, there are ways where this movie renders Clover obsolete. Like it's already, it's already dealing with those issues that she wants to raise in ways that predate her. I think it's really playing with them, and one of the things that I have trouble with is this idea that we need a film to take in the male viewer and almost like it's like a play some sort of trick. There has to be this switcheroo that's played, that here I am 1 minute kind of getting off on watching women be dismembered, and the next thing wait a second, I've found myself I'm feeling empathetic toward a woman. That this movie really, and I think you're right, Letitia, it doesn't do that. I mean, it basically says, here are the characters, and they're strong, they're interesting, they're funny, and you go along and you just kind of identify with them from the beginning. Nobody identifies with the men in this movie.
Right.
Wait a minute. I'm kidding.
That point about the Clover, the thing about the Clover article, we don't have to keep talking about it too much, but that the assumed viewer is male, like, that the movies are in order to bring men through this identification cycle. That's annoying to me, because I'm not a man, and so I don't watch them. I've never watched them the way that she describes, because that doesn't work for me. And also, I mean, what does it mean to watch as a man? There's too much to break down in that. But like what this movie does, like you guys are saying, it doesn't seem interested in that at all. But the women are so cool. Can we talk about how cool this movie is? It's so fun. And yeah. I just love every character, every female character is so interesting. And the way that nudity was happening in this movie was so different from a lot of other movies. It's just like sort of this disrobing because I want to. And the movie plays with looking in the camera, but it's funny. It's like, how ridiculous is this? Like there's something about it that's done so differently. Go ahead, sorry.
I think the nudity is never about vulnerability. And I think
exactly.
I don't think anyone is murdered in the nude in this movie. If I remember correctly. You see them showering, the girls after basketball practice. You see them playing around through the window, like disrobing, but I don't think anyone is actually killed. I mean, I might be wrong, but no one's killed in a really memorable way that I can think of when they're naked. And I think that's important. I also think something to bring up is that the more, I mean, I've always responded really well to this film, and I think the women are so cool in this movie, and I think this movie really states what it is. What your first introduction to the telephone repair woman and that situation, it's just like you'll never see that in anything else, and then also kind of see it maintained through the film. That's like, it's like just such an awesome moment. But I think the great thing this film does, and this is what kind of I think we're talking about, why we all like it so much, is it proves that these movies, the formula and what it is not contingent on misogyny and like all these terrible things and like purely male experience. It's not that. It's not predicated on that. These can be fun, good films for anybody, made by different people that are sophisticated, and it's not, we don't just relate to them simply because they speak to possibly, this bad part of us, this part that's, or that it's contingent on these things that, most of us intellectually and don't enjoy. And I think that's the great thing about this film. It kind of rehabilitates that.
Well, and at the same time, it's a standout. It's kind of an outlier in a lot of ways. When we start, as we dig a little deeper into some of these movies, I think that there are things that don't happen in this film that we may want to consider kind of definitional for our understanding of what slashers are. I think it does lose a few kind of levels of complexity, in terms of when we actually start looking at it with a more critical eye. The Burning, which I think is by far, I think, the most effective, well done movie probably ever in this genre, is the layer of complexity in there is, I think, fairly deep, and I think a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about just don't come up in here, and I think that it is kind of because there is something surfacey about it. I love everything that you're saying, and I agree 100%, but there is a sense that a lot of, and this is kind of what I was talking about with the gender roles and kind of reinforcing, is that a lot of what this movie does is simply take what would ordinarily be male characters and cast them as women. They're all jocks, and they're all in the coach comes, and it's it almost has that kind of feel about it, like a stunt. It goes deeper than that, and I don't want to disparage it because I think it does work really well. But there is something about, like where you do a production and you switch all the gender roles, and it's like, well, that can be interesting, and that can create, some interesting dynamics. But there's something surfacey in places, I think, about that.
I mean, I get a sense of that. Yeah, I do want to have more discussion about that because I've always wondered. I mean, just question my own enjoyment of it because essentially, at a certain point, Clover gets to this place in her essay, and we don't have to again keep referring to it, but I think it's a good point. Is that we identify with this final girl, the woman in the movie who destroys the monster and essentially is a kind of boyish surrogate for men that we're comfortable, putting ourselves into. And I've always wondered, do I do that with Slumber Party Massacre? Because you have they're kind of jocks, they're playing basketball, they're reading dirty magazines, you know what I mean? It's like, but I don't know. Again, that makes me question my assumptions and expectations.
Yeah.
That's
that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that when I start questioning Clover's, she basically says that in the end, a lot of the final girls are boyish, and there's something that really rubs me wrong about that. Because her definition of boyishness is that they're resourceful and that they're intelligent, and I'm like, wait a second, that's pretty upsetting. And I guess when I say they seem like male characters cast as women, I don't actually know what I mean by that.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because, because they're jocks and they look at dirty magazines. I mean, women do that, women do sports and they look at pornography and it's so. As I was watching it, I can see what you mean though. There's an sort of exaggerated, we're very sexual, we're very aggressive, we're very athletic. That might be indicating some kind of masculinity, but it's just really cool to see women getting to do that without there being any sort of consequence or judgment. And so it is an imaginary world where women get to act the way they may want to. And that might be coded as masculine behavior in our culture. But to me, this movie seems like this other beautiful world where it doesn't have to be. But I like the neighbor girl who's not at the party. I mean, I think that's a kind of subtle, more interesting character, not so sort of caricatured. And her and her sister, that dynamic was really interesting to me and not quite so exaggerately non-feminine, in air quotes. I'm using a lot of those. Doesn't really work on the radio, but I'm using yeah. So it's an interesting question. What do we mean when we say masculine characteristics?
And I agree. I was going to say I agree because, that's been my struggle. And I wonder, am I responding to that way? Because I've only seen certain kinds of representations. And it's just, it's totally uncommon to see this kind of thing. But yeah, it's good to hear that that's not how, everyone is responding to it. I do think we might have to, we kind of touched on the burning, and I do want to bring up something that is a main aspect of the burning that is totally absent from Slumber Party Massacre that I think is really significant, is the guilt aspect. And if we can talk about the subject of kind of collective guilt, and first of all, talk about how that's totally missing in Slumber Party Massacre. Nobody's guilty in Slumber Party Massacre, which is also a really strong, important thing about it.
Well, and yeah, we need Letitia to give us our rundown on the burning, but we can come back to it. I might want to argue that case about the guilt in Slumber Party, but we'll come back.
Well, I mean, no, that's what I want to talk about right now. I think that, I want to put it out to both of you, I think this is a slasher experience where, we have no history on this guy, who he is as a killer, besides he killed some people. These are women just living and doing their thing. They're not really I don't think there's any real excessive, sexuality really that I don't think that's as prevalent as in other slasher films, and I don't think anyone's there's no history, there's no historical guilt like present. No. I don't think there's, go ahead.
I think that the way the guilt works in this is, again, is almost a parody of the way these things work. And that, we have in a lot of ways, our killer is everything that the critics who don't like these movies want these movies to be, right? I mean, what these girls do that makes them the kind of false category that they're lumped into isn't false at all, is that they have the misfortune of being female. I mean, he sees them as sex objects, right? I mean, he's in love with them. He has a couple of creepy lines, right, where he's like, you're so perfect, I love you, and so I'm going to kill you.
We've all been there. Come on.
Right. That is, I think it's actually meant to be kind of a big, broad move that the movie does. Is that just like the critics say, this is a movie that's out to kill women, and that's their guilt, is that they, they're in that 50-something% of the population, and I think that's meant to be kind of something the movie's trying to say. I don't know.
That's a good point. I'd like to talk about that more, because I think that's strong, because by doing that, yeah, it does make a case that yeah, if they're guilty for being women, then I mean, there's nothing historical, there's nothing that precedes that at all, and all of that perception you get to see embodied in a really goofy, kind of lame character. Well, and I think that's a good statement.
I mean, there's nothing historical except, since Genesis, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah, but that's something that he's carrying with him. There's no immediately historical connection.
But that's true of all these movies, I think, or almost all these movies, that the victims really are guilty of nothing, that they end up just taking on the role of the guilty parties through no fault of their own. I think there's very few examples that that's not the case. We probably need to talk some about some of the other movies for me to make that point. But I think that these women are just through no fault of their own have been lumped into this group that this killer wants to take out. And I think that that's the exact same situation that happens in, Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street and The Burning, and right on down the line. It's just, and that's part of the horror. I think that this. I was joking before that we can start talking about Heidegger, but this question of being just kind of thrown into history, and you don't really have any choice in the matter. You happen to be born a woman in Slumber Party Massacre. You happen to be born on Elm Street in these other films, you happen to go to camp, you fool.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, I know we have to move on, but I do have to think that there is a distinction there, because every example you were bringing up is Nightmare on Elm Street, The Burning. There's a well, I guess, in a really broad way, it can be like kind of paralleling this really bizarre idea about guilt, and I guess, I mean, but I think, kind of removing that historical guilt does definitely foreground the absurdity of the idea that a woman is guilty, and that pretty much, like I was saying before, we just kind of I went in a circle, but that the guy who's acting out on this is just he's ridiculous, like he's laughable, like in a lot of ways. But I think we can move on to The Burning, like, and start talking about the guilt there, because that's a more clear, traditional kind of guilt in a slasher movie. It's a film I love. But this was your pick, Letitia.
Yeah, The Burning. So it's I guess it would be considered a pretty traditional camp movie, but I think it does a lot of different things than the ones that are more familiar. So we'll talk about that. But it kind of starts with a scene in which some naughty campers play a trick on I guess he's a janitor or a gardener, somebody who works at a camp. He's called Cropsy, which is a name for like a little myth. I think in New Jersey there was a documentary about this called Cropsy. It's kind of a mythical child killing figure. But anyway, his name's Cropsy, and he's accidentally burned by these campers who are playing a trick on him. And so then we fast forward to the future. So that's the moment of the guilt happening. This character's been burned, and etc. So then we meet this whole new set of campers. Among them is Jason Alexander in his first movie, I think. And also Holly Hunter is also in this movie. And who is it? Who's Woodstock? What's his name? Fisher Stevens also.
Yep.
So a lot of people who became really, became actors later too. So anyway, as these guys come to camp, these murders seem to be happening again. And we have a scene of Cropsy getting out of the hospital. And that kind of sets off, he has I guess he's hired a prostitute, and she's horrified by his face. And this kind of sets off the whole chain of events, it seems, of him going back to the camp and murdering the campers. But I think this movie is really interesting in that it kind of follows male characters, but also when I was watching it, this was the first slasher movie I started when we decided on this theme. And so I'm actually not super familiar with this genre. So maybe it was just my viewing experience. But for me, I was most interested in how I wasn't sure who was going to be the final girl or final person. I don't think the movie really telegraphs that so clearly as some other movies do. And also the way that it follows the boys or young men in a really close way, and their kind of intimate moments, as opposed to a lot of these movies that seem to be more likely to follow young women. There's a lot more interesting things. I love this movie too, so I'll move on to you guys though to see what you have to think.
Well, I want to take a second and just throw out that I really love this movie. I've said already that I think this is would be my pick as the quintessential, despite, like you said, what it does with some of the how it plays with some of our expectations with gender. But I just want to give a shout out to the look of this movie. I just want to live inside this movie.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it actually is just very evocative, and like right up until people start getting axed, it's like, yeah, I want to go to summer camp, man.
Right.
And I think that is one of the strengths too, is that this is just a really well made movie. I mean, you rattled off a list of actors who went on to greater things, but I think that's part of it. They really did get a pretty strong cast. It's with a pretty strong script. I mean, this movie it takes quite a while to actually get going, and it's kind of it has a whole first act that really seems like something else, and I think it invests that time wisely. And I just think it's a really solid film all around.
It's really slick. It also has the participation of the great Tom Savini,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean the effects in this movie, the gore. I mean, this is not something we ever talk about, but I mean, this is a brutal, brutal movie. Like, the violence in this movie is intense. Like, and I think that that's something that's really interesting about it, is that it is a really slick movie. It's beautiful. I love the score, Rick Wakeman. But this great production value and, like, making essentially what is kind of, we can put in quotes, a better movie, results in something that is, this one is unsettling to me. It's brutal. It's horrifying. It has a degree of kind of like nastiness that is really interesting to me and fun. It's one of the most fun. But I'd say this movie's pretty turbocharged. I don't know how else to put it. This is like a cranked up kind of slasher film that really, really delivers. But I totally agree. Like, this is pretty quintessential. Great place to start.
Yeah, I agree about the gore and the deaths in the movie, and something about this sort of idyllic, beautiful beginning and slowly getting to know the characters, and then someone's gonna die. And I was actually really dreading anyone dying in this movie. I was not having any fun in thinking about how are they gonna kill? I didn't want anyone to die. I liked all these people, even the ones that are kind of like the more negative characters. And we could talk. I think the most interesting is the kind of creepy character who seems to be the focus of the movie at some point. I think his name's Alfred or something. I don't know. Like that's kind of a character who is called a creep and a pervert, and actually kind of is. I mean, he kind of is creepy, and he does do this peeping Tom thing, but he's still really sympathetic. Even like the bully, the guy named can't remember what his name, Glazer or something. He's like a really bully character. And these dynamics between these two, of like the bully who is so, he's got so much to prove, and he has so much of this vulnerability, and this guy who's having everyone else's sort of vulnerabilities about their masculinity being thrown on him. I think that it plays gender stuff really well, but also makes you like the characters, and that there's nobody that I wanted to see have anything bad happen to them. That was really a crazy trick to me. And the movie has these moments when people die. Do you guys remember the moment when there's this raft? The raft comes in with the characters who've been killed, right? And there's this cut scene to all the campers on the ground crying, and they're being comforted. And I just was like, wow, in most slashers, you don't see a scene of all camp kids crying over people. Like, it just has an interesting mix of tones, and it makes strange things happen emotionally to me. It was very interesting.
I think you really hit on something pretty important there, because I think that one of the aspects of these movies is that although they always seem to start with some sort of communal event, whether it's a sorority house or a party or camp or whatever, the deaths are almost always like a very isolated thing. That, like, everyone dies alone, and and that's not true here. Like, it's kind of one of the comedic parts about a lot of these movies is that somebody can make their way through a house killing a dozen people and nobody knows about it, And as soon as you do know about it, you're dead. And but you're right that the violence and the deaths in here are kind of like a communal event. Like, people, and we actually see people like making plans and trying to figure out how to deal with it, and that is pretty different.
I have I agree with this emotional investment that we have with these characters that we don't get in some of these other films. And so as a slasher film, I think what does that do to our experience? Like, was our experience with this film different than some of the other ones? Because I do feel, I don't want to see Woodstock die. I don't want to see these people die. I feel something when they do. I mean, I think there's a performance dimension to that, but does that change our experience of these? Is this different from then, like, a Friday the 13th Part 3, or something like that, to say maybe we care about those characters less as it, but.
Well, I think that it obviously is a difference, when they actually feel like characters enough that you want to see, where they're going as characters. What's interesting to me is how little any of that had to do with the finale, the climax of the movie. Like that. And I think that I might feel that way about a lot of these films, that where you end up, and I know that Clover and a lot of other people would disagree with this quite a bit, but where you end up seems a lot less important than getting there. That it's that it is that kind of working your way through the formula. You know that you're going to have your fake out scare. You know that somebody, who's going to die first, or you have a pretty good idea. And that kind of experiential kind of thing is a lot bigger than where the movie lands. I also want to say that part of you used the word, Chris, that there's something nasty about it. And that was my experience of this movie. And Letitia, you have a much more positive kind of reaction to these characters than I do. Although I agree with you, they seem really human in a way that we don't necessarily expect from these movies. But I felt like every relationship in this movie was a power relationship. It was a power play. That it was just, we saw characters move from one place where somebody was, just controlling the situation or attempting to control the situation, and then that character would move on where they would attempt to do the same thing to somebody else. The boys with each other, the Glazer with with Alfred, all the male and female relationships in this movie was just every scene was a date rape scene. That it was just pushing the limits of power relationships. And it was interesting, and I like what you said, Letitia, is that then we see those people turn around and they show us some sort of humanity. Like Glazer really is allowed to be more than the bully. He is allowed to seem more human than that. But it's uncomfortable. I mean, a lot of this movie is uncomfortable. The death almost seems secondary.
Well, let me bring this up then, because this is something I thought about, was that it almost feels like this is, you say it is like the quintessential slasher in a way. It's like kind of the best this can get. I almost feel it's almost like straining almost to be, that it is almost something else, because it is satisfying in a lot of ways that sometimes these films aren't necessarily attempting to be. But I feel like this almost pushes beyond, and the slasher element is a skeleton that exists and is a part of this, but this film is a lot, that's in air quotes, a lot more in a way. And that's what I've always kind of thought about it.
Well, I think that what it does is that it takes something that's implicit in a lot of these movies and makes it more explicit, which is that a lot of these movies are coming of age stories. The slasher movie is a kind of coming of age, and that whatever the final girl attains at the end, I guess we could consider a very damaged adulthood. That's what they get ahead of themselves. They're called horror movies for a reason, right? But
yeah.
But this movie just, it's almost a Meatballs kind of thing for 45 minutes, right? I mean, it is, and you could see it going a completely different direction, where it really is just it could become a touching coming of age story.
I think that that this issue of that the working through these murders and this murderer coming is kind of a lot of times a metaphor for working through power relationships, and so like Josh said, it's really uncomfortable. I agree. The way that people use each other, the way people are cruel to each other, but it seems so real. Mm-hmm. But I think that layer is, usually swept away. And this whole, the challenge of escaping a murderer or getting out of the camp is the thing that it's about usually. And so it almost adds too much. It almost does seem like the murders are superfluous in a way. What's the point of that? And I think that comes to the ending being a little bit of a downer, because it seems to come back to the slasher formula of the final people finishing some ceremony that the slasher seems to enact.
And at the same time, camps seem like this natural place for these stories, and a lot of these movies, I think this movie ends around a campfire, right? I mean, that idea of the kind of urban legend ghost story, which you guys were talking about before, that there is that simplicity, but yeah, then this just takes that and just really builds on it, and I agree, it does become kind of something different because it's fleshed out a lot more, and it's interesting that the way in which it just allowing the characters that time at the beginning to become characters really does just flavor the whole thing.
Well, I do want to say that it is. We did say they're horror movies. I do find this film horrifying, and I don't find a lot of the films, especially in this genre, that at all. And I want to come back to something you said, Letitia, where like you didn't want to see these people die. You didn't really want the death. I mean, when you see it, it's so kind of insanely like hyper real, and kind of beautiful in its own way. Like Tom Savini as an artist, incredible. But like I didn't want to see I did not want to see these people die either. But in other films from this genre, I do want to see that. I do want to see that, but I don't think it's because I dislike the characters. I think something we can talk about is the formula. I want to see that because I enjoy the other films that are not The Burning because they are so formulaic. And I want to experience the pleasure of something conforming to the script that I have for what these films do. And if murder is part of that, but I don't think explicitly or specifically there's something that I'm getting from that. Really, I think a lot of the pleasure of these movies is this formula. And now I think I experienced The Burning in a very, very different way because it totally has its own kind of pacing. It has its own tone. And I want something very different from it. So that's where I came to with the film. But we can talk about, I don't want to try to, I do want to try to get to this idea of guilt because that was something we wanted to talk about with this film, and this is a very clear instance of that, where at the beginning of the film, these campers think that they kill this caretaker, whoever he is, and we have this somebody coming back to seek revenge. So I'd like to talk about this collective guilt in this film.
I mean, in a way, it's just, it seems like for a lot of these movies, that's simply the catalyst, right? I mean, it's the urban legend, the necessity of the urban legend that there's got to be something to set the killer in motion, right? And so, because obviously, well, there is one character who bears some guilt in this movie, but he gets to live too. But these campers are not guilty of anything, and but they're there was a generation before them, and but then they have to suffer for it. And I don't know, a lot of every time we start talking about something that seems rather kind of like some sort of analogy, it always, in these movies, it always feels really very real to me. The analogy just kind of is like, yeah, no, that's kind of the way the world works, and that's Clover says that where pornography is about sex, that horror movies, slasher movies are about gender, and I think that it's that. And I'll say it again: this is where Slumber Party makes this explicit. It's the same kind of dynamic. It's this question of guilt that you have no control over, and it always, and it tends to come back around to gender. That somebody is in power over somebody else, and in this film, even when the boys are harassing each other, there's a lot of kind of gendered talk in that. You can't, anywhere you scrape, that kind of wells up to the top.
Yeah, I think that's the same thing I got from this too, like power, like the guilt of the powerful on the the people without power. But I thought that was what was interesting with gender in this one, that it was mostly about like dealing with masculinity in a very specific way, not so much in relationship to femininity. Also, air quotes. Whenever we use those words, I kind of lose track of what we're talking about sometimes. But but it's interesting at the end, right? The person who is actually somewhat responsible lives and saves the boy, the young man, who is one of the least powerful. So he gets to kind of undo what he did. But then I don't really, like, we begin with power, like the campers seem to have some power over this guy. And that almost seems like class power to me. Like, these kids seem to be perhaps upper class or middle class, and here's a guy who's like some kind of hired help at a camp. So I see. I go with. I'm always interested in class. So the moment I saw that, I latched onto it like a dog on a toy or something. But so it might not be relevant. But I do think it's mostly about power, and it's only gendered in because power is gendered in our in the way we talk about it. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I lost track of what I was saying. But go ahead.
I think I'm right there with you, and I think that we have to keep in mind. Chris, you opened by talking about a simplicity in these movies, and I think that we keep bumping up against the kind of broad strokes that lay down what is masculine and what is feminine, and because those don't ring particularly true for us. But I think that is exactly the kind of idiom of these movies that that they do work in that. These movies do use really broad strokes to determine what's masculine and what's feminine, and it makes me self-conscious when I start talking in that idiom, but that's the vocabulary of these movies.
I was going to say, I think that's what makes them so interesting is that if these films, yes, like they are about gender and they're about definitions being dramatized, and I think that's really important what you were saying, Letitia, that whenever we start using these words like masculinity, femininity, like that's a very, very absolutely complex, idea that if you're going to have any kind of critical approach to these films, you're going to encounter. Whether they invite that or not, consciously invite that, I don't really know. Honestly, I don't really think so. But if you are going to approach them in any way, all of a sudden it becomes maybe the most complex horror film that you're going to approach, because these dramatize in a way things that are so fundamental to our society. And it's been a very complex discussion that I feel like we've been having, because their simplicity and the casualness and the broad strokes that they use hold up a very intense mirror to a lot of assumptions that we all have. I think that is something that has been even difficult for me to approach these films.
I think so, and I think that's what I mean, is that this movie is kind of as painful as it is and as effective as it is because it also feels really true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like the power relations in this film feel true, and I think that and that, not to promote more stereotypes, but I think that we do live in a culture where women are routinely victimized by and that, like, I think you said it really well, Chris, that we've got these kind of ideas being dramatized. We've got these kind of broad categories, these types, and they're being put in action. And I think that there is something to be learned from it. I think it is pretty effective.
It's also about adolescence, though. Like, this is what we do when we're that age, when we're figuring out who we are and what it means to be a man or a woman. You kind of perform a role, and you try to figure out which role makes sense. And that's what I see a lot of the male characters doing, like deciding what makes you a man, what's perverted sexuality and what's normal sexuality. Like, at one point, the Glazer guy tells the Alfred guy or something that, pornography is perverted, which is kind of an odd. I mean, I've never heard a young man say that. Like, it's just he's trying to figure out, like, what do real men do? Like, because you're playing a role at that point. So a lot of it is about figuring that out.
I think there's a psychological dimension there that's interesting, though, because most of these adolescents are being played by adults. There's kind of a weird non-intentional, bizarre psychological dimension to that, where they're still acting out these traumatic, like, scripts from their past,
right.
Like that influence their quote unquote fully formed, like, sexual identity or whatever. And the worst one is, Glazer is, a big doofus, guy. I think his name is Eddie, the character that goes for a swim. This kind of, like, that kind of like seething naturalistic actor that goes for a swim with I forget who it is. Do you know who I'm talking about? That goes skinny dipping,
Right.
and he's
Yeah.
like he's really aggressive in a way that's
Right.
really uncomfortable and very adult in a
Yes,
way
yeah.
that I think that he's the most like kind of monstrous to me, like to a point where he's the one who makes me feel really uncomfortable, because that's like he's unresolved because he just is nasty and dumb and like totally looking for some. But anyway, I think it's interesting that these things are dramatized by adults. I don't know where that's going, but I found that of interest.
You know, what makes this interesting, Letitia, you already brought this up, is that our final girl in this movie, I might argue, just doesn't exist. But if she does, she's a boy. And what that does to the kind of formula, and I guess what I mean by him not really seeming like a final girl to me is that he starts out as being one with the fewest resources as a character, and he kind of ends that way. He doesn't, you know, what we kind of expect as these movies move through is that once the movie kind of latches on to who that character is going to be, is that we see that they are kind of continually the most resourceful, the most intelligent, the most kind of able. And he's really not. I mean, he's just kind of he just runs a lot and basically gets saved at the end, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah, I had this feeling that the ending was sort of setting us up for that he would be the next Cropsey. You know, like, because he ends in such a sort of, he's been kind of there's a better word for this. There's a real word, demasculinized. There's a real word for that, but that's not the real word. Like he has all of this sort of agency and power taken away, even in surviving. It kind of made me think of the end of Alice, Sweet Alice, where we realize that the person we thought was, well, I shouldn't spoil Alice, Sweet Alice, but there's this ending point where a character who actually was kind of innocent in a way is like looking all diabolical. Like at the end, really, that person's going to be a killer. And I had this feeling when it ended, like, oh, Alfred's going to become this killer because he has all the characteristics of Cropsey. He's rejected by women. He doesn't have much power. Other people use their power over him. And it just ends that way too. So I don't know.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And of course, what we haven't really talked about is the penchant that these movies have for turning into franchises, you know, monstrous, unending franchises. And, you know, and that might be what The Burning 2 would look like. Because it seems interesting to me that survivors in these films kind of go one way or the other, right? They become monstrous themselves, or they become, you know, crazy, or they become the eternal survivor, you know, like in the Halloween films or something, you know. But yeah, I agree. Old Alfred, he'd go around the bend one way.
And maybe like that kind of like the dramatizing of that idea of like there will always be a new killer, there will always be a new monster. You know, in a certain sense, there will always be new teenagers, and there will always be new people like encountering essentially what is like the front lines of gender and sexual dynamics. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying teenagers are monsters. I'm saying that their experiences are really fraught. There's a reason why they're the center of these films. I mean, also because they're a huge market and they want them to go see these films. But also, but yeah, like I think that cycle, this is an unending, you know, there isn't a way to kill the slasher. Like, I don't think really, I mean, maybe there isn't, maybe that's a really good theoretical kind of, you know, or like something that needs to be approached and understood, like how would you really kill, you know, something like this. But we do have to move on to Malevolence, just at least to give it a cursory kind of assessment. It was my pick from 2003, Stephen Mina. I did not like this film. I wanted to choose something new so that we had something, a newer film to kind of like look at, you know, if people wanted to see. It's essentially a hybrid. It's about a bank robbery that goes wrong and people that end up in a house with a killer by happenstance, a slasher situation. And this killer that's maybe been dormant in this house comes back and starts killing these people that unfortunately there's these hostages and these bank robbers end up in the house. They're getting picked off. It's a hybrid of a bank robbery movie, a slasher movie, and then like a new school kind of psychological Seven-esque serial killer kind of movie. And I think it's just not very successful. Yeah, not successful. Maybe there's a couple things going for it in the fact that it has a few nice images, but I don't think it's really relevant. I don't think unless you both want to, I don't really want to talk much about this film, but I do want to find just a point we could make to talk about it. I don't know, like the idea maybe of formula, or the idea of that these films do a lot of the same things, and that's where a lot of the satisfaction comes from for me.
I think even The Burning, which, Letitia, you pointed out the ways that it doesn't look like our archetypal slasher movie. Everything it does still operates completely within that framework. It just does, in Chris's words, a lot more in there. It kind of just fleshes the skeleton out a lot more. But this movie just dismantles the skeleton. It doesn't really have much use for it. It likes certain images from the slasher movies. It likes certain ideas. It wants to set a monster loose in the middle of its movie, but it doesn't have any time or use for the formula or the structure and the things that we expect, and it suffers for it. I mean, it doesn't work. What you've got is a killer in a movie, and that's not as interesting. There's a million movies with killers in them, but there's something very different about the whole complex that slasher movies set up.
Yeah, I feel like something psychological is really missing from this. Like, I couldn't find a point to the killer. Like, not that it all has to have some equation that makes sense to some other idea, but that I couldn't figure out why the choices had been made. And I had to think about, why are they making these choices, which is the death of the movie immediately. While you're watching it, you're like, I wonder why they chose to make that Halloween-like music or whatever. When the thing, like, I just didn't. It feels like slasher movies, or at least Clover uses this term. Jesus, what's the word? Like OCD, obsessive. There's an obsessive kind of patterning to it, as though you, like when you wash your hands obsessively when you think there's some blood on them, like that makes sense, and the sort of obsessive patternings do something, whereas this, I didn't understand what it was even trying to do with them.
And I think the interesting thing about that is that these films, the slasher film for me is a very, very psychological experience, and I think that actually this film attempts to deal with ideas of psychology with this serial killer dimension. But there's a difference. Slasher movies are not serial killer movies. And I think that's because serial killer movies are about psychology, and a slasher movie is a more psychological experience because it has stronger imagistic kind of ideas. It has this experiential dimension. I had said earlier to both of you that I feel like these movies can be really calming. They can have this kind of womb-like idea. There's a lot of atmospheric and really specific elements in these that I feel like have really strong psychological resonance. And this film doesn't, it's concerned with something else. And I think that's a misstep.
These are the Freudian films, whereas slashers are just wholly kind of Jungian. They just go, and they have their archetypes, and they play out their patterns, and it works on us.
Yeah, so I'm studying therapy right now, doing my master's, and we keep being told to keep it simple. Never try to go into theorizing or interpreting what somebody says, because you take them out of their immediate experience into cognitive experience. And so they're able to think about their feelings or kind of, say something about them instead of actually experiencing them. And I think that really is the key difference between a lot of kind of horror movies and the slasher, like you were just saying, that it's it gets to a point and it's experiential. That word is super important. Like, you physically are feeling a lot of things in the body somatically. because of that simplicity, where you don't have to stop and think about it. And I think that's why it's considered kind of a stupid or simple genre, because it doesn't require thinking about it or deconstructing it to enjoy it. Whereas I think some films you get out and you want to talk about what that meant or whatever, and you can with these. I mean, that's a way in which to experience them. But I think that on the most immediate level, you don't have to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're right that experiential is the key word. I was thinking about, like, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is...
No.
I mean, it's like, you know, you're going to experience that in a completely different way. And to even talk about enjoying that movie, or, you know, to even talk about its strengths as a movie, you have to intellectualize it. You know, you have... But that's not the case with, you know, Friday the 13th. You know, you're in it.
And there's something to be said for the fact that you can leave a slasher movie, opposed to I think a lot of other horror, and especially something like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, are these things that are more horrific and intense. Maybe The Burning notwithstanding, but I think you can walk out of a slasher movie and say, I liked this. I really liked that. It's a very positive kind of experience because it's such an individual experience, because I feel it's so psychological. Like, I liked it when this happened. I liked this. You know, I feel like that's a strength of it. And now we said, like, they do deny a kind of, like, conscious, complex, intellectual, like, experience of them. But look at when we short circuit and what we've done when we kind of reapproach them. They're so rich because they're so simple.
What I find interesting about it is, and I have no answer to this question at all, is, you know, I mean, basically, Hollywood would have kept making these movies forever if they continued to make the kind of money they were making. But somewhere in the 80s, they just simply stopped. You know, they just didn't anymore. And I have no, you know, I don't know if it was just, you know, the market was glutted and, you know, but I'm not sure what that is about that particular time frame, the, you know, late 70s through most of the 80s, that made them so ripe for this story. I mean, really just unending iterations of the same story. You know, people just couldn't get enough. And, you know, I mean, but then hair metal died at the same time, so it was just an end of an era all around, you know?
It was sad.
Yeah. Like, let's light a candle for Motley Crue. But no, I agree. I don't know what happened. I don't know. I think, you know, and I think it's open to the forces of, like, whatever was going on in the industry. You know, obviously it's a demand, you know, thing, but you know, I think there will be a place for these films, and I think maybe it might have transformed into something else, but you see lingering elements of it in a lot of newer films. Actually, I can't imagine there's still a lot of new horror that has these elements, even the Saw films, you know what I mean? Like, and what was hugely successful, you know, so I think there still is a place for this.
But what's interesting is that, you know, what we're living through right now is just this unending remake cycle. And, you know, almost everything has been remade now. You know, there's a Friday the 13th, there's a Nightmare on Elm Street, there's a Valentine's one.
My Bloody Valentine.
My Bloody Valentine. You know, they've done them all. And what's interesting is how when they return to them and they try and make them slicker and they try and make them, you know, gorier, and I have yet to see a single remake that gets anywhere near anything that makes these movies what they are. And it's because they've abandoned a lot of the formula, I think. You know, I don't know why, for all the supposed interest in these films that's happening right now, why we don't see any real examples of these films.
I think the formula the formula might have just become so expected that people want to not use it, but it's so effective, or it was. I don't know. I mean, could you watch a movie now that came out now and had this that did the sort of Veredika, another Vinker, laid out this format? Would you not be a little disappointed if it came out exactly the way you expected? Or, because I think about this, like, how can you use a formula and play with it, yet still take what is interesting and psychologically interesting about it.
But nobody ever gets to the end of a really good sonnet and goes, "Oh man, but why the couplet at the end?" You know?
No, I think you're right. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's a question of content. There is, I mean, just the films we're talking about tonight, and all of them, they aren't the same movie.
Right.
I mean, but they, they're just, but they certainly are tapping into the same, structure and the same themes. But obviously, I mean, with any structure, there's endless opportunity for variation in there.
Well, and this thing of but I think the movies went into the sort of, we don't want to leave this final girl. And so there was a lot of killing of the main characters or shifting of the main characters or somehow subverting expectations in that way. And I think that part, I think there's some desire to innovate the form that isn't paying attention to how useful it can be.
I think you're right, and I think it has a lot to do with kind of one-upmanship in the industry, that it's like, this movie has to be more brutal than the last, so we'll kill all the characters off and we'll just focus on, the killing and how gory it can be and lost where the real horror is.
Well, real quick, kind of, just to touch this really quick and then maybe move to some final thoughts, is that, maybe something like Nightmare on Elm Street, the effect that has is that's such a conceptual film, it has such a strong concept that it kind of, but it is partially a slasher movie in a lot of ways, but it's something very different. And maybe that the success of that kind of opens up a way to kind of misread what's good about slasher movies and might have caused some confusion where people are like, we've got to reinvent it every time, like Nightmare on Elm Street reinvented it, like Child's Play reinvented it, but those movies become something very, very different. And there needs to be understood that I think a slasher movie, a pure slasher film, works and is something different and doesn't, need to be, it's not a really strong concept or a new concept-driven kind of thing. It doesn't need to be reinvented every time. And maybe there was a kind of misunderstanding of what those films were, because I think they do have a place. But I don't want to. I'm sorry that I'm giving myself the final word on that. But I do want to hear last thoughts on what we think, recommendations for these films, and just a parting thought.
For recommendations, I have something. Well, I loved watching these. I am one of the people who totally missed this. I was pretty young in the 80s, but even as a kid and as a preteen, I just wasn't interested. I thought they just weren't serious enough, and I wanted to be serious. So I missed it. So I loved revisiting these, and I loved My Bloody Valentine and The Burning, and there were so many. Sleepaway Camp was incredibly bizarre, almost like if David Lynch made a horror, made a slasher. I found it so weirdly unnerving. But there were so many that I thought were incredible. And I loved Friday the 13th Part 2. There were so many. And I think this is a genre that doesn't get its due. And I'm glad we did an episode about it.
Yeah, basically the same. And I have a soft spot in my heart for the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. I think, I think they do, variation on the form. And I think, that it's an endlessly rich, although, in theory, the Elm Street kids have to die out at some point, right? I mean,
not Johnny Depp. He's doing great.
I did watch all three of the Slumber Party Massacre films in preparation. I actually watched all of Slumber Party Massacre 2. Didn't turn it off once.
Hey.
They seem like a great opportunity for movies to just do what only movies can do.
Good, very, very good point. And I think that's where the strength for me of these films lie. And I think we threaten it a lot, but I think in the spirit of slasher films, this is definitely an episode that deserves a sequel. So there will be probably the Brood Goes to Camp Part 2 or Brood Away Camp. It would also be a good one. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and be on the lookout for the potential second part of this episode, which will be coming your way. And thanks again. Have a great night.